finish that up, and then we'll move on to the Jewish mysticism, which we'll cover in the next couple of weeks. We talked about the Philosopher's Stone, correct? And we talked about the quintessence as the fifth element. Now, there's a text called the Emerald Tablets, a very short text. Goodrick Clark includes it in his book, so you can read it there. And it is kind of a summary of the concept of convergences and harmony and sympathy, in the technical alchemical sense, sympathy. Okay, this seems to be originated as an Arabic text, and it's probably related to the idea that Hermes wrote an Emerald Tablet, because Hermes gets continued on in the Arabic tradition as well as the Western traditions. Okay, so this it's really, you probably read it in the book, it's really kind of obscure, which is true of a lot of esotericism. You can't tell with many esoteric texts if they're just incoherent and intentionally obscure, or if there's some profound secret of the world there. And, sometimes you think it's one, sometimes you think it's the other. But, it's obscure, so it could be interpreted in lots of different ways, but it becomes a major text for kind of summarizing the assumptions, the cosmological assumptions of the alchemical and then later general esoteric ideas. Now, much of alchemy is associated with medicine. That is, part of it is about nature, and part of it is about metals and transmuting metals, and part of it's about nature. But part of it is about your biological system, because just as you can convert lead into gold, you can, in theory, convert dead cells or weak cells or bad cells into immortal or better cells. And so medicine is viewed, or at least there is a medical aspect of alchemical thought, which carries on all the way to a guy named Paracelsus, which I think there was a discussion of Paracelsus in Goodrick Clark, right?
Yeah.
That should be a yes. Paracelsus was a alchemical medical guy. He, was a doctor, a practicing physician, but he was interpreting all the physical questions in alchemical ways, which at his time in the 16th century was not necessarily unscientific, right? Although we today would say he is unscientific. If you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that novel, Frankenstein reads Paracelsus to get some of his ideas about reviving the, Frankenstein's monster, artificial man. Anyway, there's two things that come out of this. One is called the panacea, which means the cure-all. It is essentially kind of like the Philosopher's Stone that can cure all disease. You take it, just makes you better from everything. That was called Dr. Smith's snake oil in the 1880s West. But anyway, the other is the elixir of life. And this is a drink that essentially either gives you, it's kind of like the panacea. It can cure you, but it also gives you longevity and then also, in theory, immortality. So the search for the elixir of life, this is kind of like the search for, who was it? Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth. Fountain of Youth is an elixir of life idea, okay, if you remember those stories. Then there finally is an idea of spiritual alchemy. This is the idea that alchemical processes not only transmute matter and heal the body, but can purify and deify the soul, okay? So there's a spiritual aspect to that. And note a couple things about spiritual alchemy. Number one is most modern New Age alchemist types are into spiritual alchemy, not so much practical alchemy, although there are some of those. And the second is, this becomes very important for Jungian psychology. I don't know if you guys know who Jung is. We'll probably talk about him a little bit later. But he is a major transitional figure between kind of esotericism and psychology, which is a big issue now among esotericists, is that it's a psychological thing. And Jung is kind of the founder of that movement, even though I don't know if he'd agree with what they come up with. I mean, his ideas are foundational to their interpretations. Okay? And Jung is very much into alchemy as a symbolic system about the psychology of the soul. Any questions on that? Here's a couple of major figures in the history of alchemy, and most of these are kind of legendary, right? I mean, there's other later ones. These are the classical period ones. And Jabir ibn Hayyan is a key figure because his Arabic writings get translated in about the 9th century into Latin and become the foundation of Latin alchemy, more than the Hellenistic alchemy, which gets translated or preserved by the Byzantines and doesn't appear on the scene in the West till later. So what you've got is Hellenistic alchemy, which goes into a Byzantine version and an Arabic version. And then the Arabic version is in Geber. I mean, he's one of the leading figures. And then that gets translated to the Latin West, and then later the Byzantine comes in. Okay? Because, anyway, it's complicated history, and there are several books here that talk about these things. This one is a primary reader. So if you want to read what the alchemists are talking about, some of it is pretty incomprehensible. And a lot of it is coded language. That is to say, they don't want other guys to get their secrets, so they code it. And some of it is just a lot of symbolic language where we would, use AU for gold. They use some type of symbol, and that's gold, right? And so there's a lot of this kind of arcane symbolism in there. And there's a lot of esoteric art that develops in the Renaissance and after, which can be found in this book. And it's got, esotericists just love making kind of wildly symbolic pictures with all sorts of complexities in them that have all sorts of hidden meanings and stuff. And there's a whole study of, the art of esotericism. And this is a great book because it just has reproductions of tons of esoteric and alchemical pictures. And you look at them and you kind of hide to Kolob when you look at those pictures. It's interesting. Okay, any questions about alchemy? Okay, now we're going to turn to Jewish mysticism. And basically, until the midterm, we are going to be studying Jewish mysticism. We are going to go into this in a more in-depth way than we have with paganism, and we are going to read primary texts a lot more. From now on, we'll be reading lots of primary texts, at least till the last week or two. Now, we have 2 books on this topic. The first one is Schaeffer's Origins of Jewish Mysticism. He basically covers the phenomenon from Ezekiel in the Bible up till the Merkabah and Hekalot traditions, which are about 600 AD. So, 600 BC to 600 AD. Okay? His approach is, number 1, philological, number 2, textual, number 3, historical. He is looking for the development of ideas, finding an idea, seeing how it develops, and looking at change through time and things like that. Our other book, and it ends by 600, which in many ways, the most important developments, at least for contemporary interpretations of Jewish mysticism, are much later than this. It's Zohar and Isaac Luria. This other book is quite different. It is a collection of primary texts from the beginnings of Jewish mysticism, which would go back into this period, a little bit after the time of Christ, up until the present, and includes at least some guys from the 18th, 19th century, if not, clearly contemporary. So this surveys Jewish mysticism. However, it is mainly from the Zohar on, which is 1300 AD, and from Luria, who was one of the major Kabbalists and mystics, who's about, a little bit before 1600 AD. Okay, and his emphasis is mainly on that post stuff. So, in a sense, this book is everything before this book starts, even though they overlap a bit. Does that make sense to people? The other difference is this Untermann's book is thematic, and he mixes Kabbalistic and mystical texts from lots of different places and times and organizes them thematically. This is in some ways cherry picking. That is, he in some ways gives you an impression of more continuity and similarity within Jewish mysticism than there really is. Whereas Schaeffer emphasizes the historical development change through time, Untermann is more static. Okay, so just bear that in mind. It's not that one approach is good and one approach is bad, they're just different. You need to recognize the limitations and methodological questions associated with each approach. Okay, Schaeffer's first point, and hopefully you discuss these in your essays. There's an unbroken continuity between early apocalypses and Hekalot literature. So the first thing we need to know is, how did you find Schaeffer? Can you understand him, or is it too complicated? A little of both? It's a complicated book. It kind of assumes probably a higher level of knowledge than you've got, so we'll go through it and explain some of these things. So, I hope it's not too advanced for you. Not advanced. I mean, I think you could understand it if you knew the context of what he's talking about. Okay, what's apocalypse then? Basically, this is the summary of his chapters. It begins with the Bible and Ezekiel's vision. Okay? Then it goes to Enochian texts about the ascent and apocalypse of Enoch. And then it goes to other ascent apocalypses, then to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the related mystical texts there, then to Philo, who is the Platonist mystic, and then the rabbis, and finally concludes with the Hekalot and Merkabah mystics, who are then foundational for the next phase. So what he wants to figure out is why we start with things like Ezekiel and Enoch, and we end with things like the Zohar, because there's a major shift in ideology there. Okay, so that's kind of the summary of the different periods. And Ezekiel's about 600 BC, Enoch text about 300 to 200 BC, apocalypses are maybe 300 BC to 100 AD, Dead Sea Scrolls, 2nd, 1st centuries BC, Philo, 1st century AD, the early rabbis, maybe 200 through 600 AD, or the rabbinic stuff, and the Hekalot texts are maybe 1st century to 6th century AD, roughly speaking. Okay, he gives some dates in here, so I didn't write them down here. He gives them in the book. Okay, so first question: what's an apocalypse? We talk about the zombie apocalypse, which I am well prepared for. I have lacrosse armor and foam rubber things to put on my arm, and I have big, heavy gloves. See, any smart person would actually wear armor to fight the zombies and not run around with your hands bare, right? Am I right?
Yes.
Anyway, zombie apocalypse means kind of end of the world. That's really not what apocalypse means. What does it mean? Yeah.
It means a revelation.
Right. It means an unfolding or an unveiling or a revelation of an idea. And what it's talking about, revelation of the things at the end of time or in future times, maybe not necessarily the end, but generally they focus on the end. So an apocalypse is a revelation of unique knowledge from God, kind of the mysteries of God, generally undertaken by a prophet who ascends into heaven or at least has heavenly secrets revealed to him by an angel or something. So Daniel, for example, never ascends into heaven, but he has a heavenly vision and he has angels that come and give him information. On the other hand, John, the author of the Revelation in the New Testament, Book of Revelations, it's actually called the Apocalypsis Jesu Christu, which means the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, or the revelation of Jesus Christ. So it's called Revelation because that's what apocalypse means. But it's the revelation of Jesus Christ to John. And how does he get it? First, Christ appears to him on earth, and then he ascends into heaven and sees God in his temple, and he sees the Ark of the Covenant there and all sorts of stuff, and then has this revelation given to him. So apocalypse is from scholarly point of view, it's a genre, but it is a revelation of future things. Now, Hekalot literature, Hekal in Hebrew means temple. Hekal, or palace, it means big building, but the temple is called the Hekal, and so is the king's palace. Those are generally what are called Hekal in Hebrew. Hekalot is the plural ending. So OT is a plural ending in Hebrew. So Hekal, temple, Hekalot, temples, or palaces.
Is it just a plural ending, or is it female or neuter?
That's the female ending, right. There's other, Eem is the plural, the masculine ending. You're
so
right,
like
sorry.
Elliot isn't Elliot a name that's actually female because El is God and Eol
I think Ot there is supposed to be sign, like sign of God or something like that. So I don't think,
Oh.
it sounds the same, but I think it's a different Hebrew word. I'd have to check. But I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, there's other ways that comes out. And a lot of generic nouns are feminine. That is, say, grammatical femininity does not necessarily indicate gender feminine. But it just depends on the word. And I'm not sure what Elliot comes from. Anyway, Hekalot literature is a particular type of apocalypse in which the visionary ascends to heaven and enters into and meets God in his celestial temple. So one assumption of these texts is that there's a temple in heaven where God dwells. Okay, and you see that in the book of Revelation, where John goes up to heaven and sees God. He's in his temple. He calls it the temple. The heavens opened. I behold the temple. The doors open. I saw the Ark of the Covenant. God seated on a throne there, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what he's talking about is how do we get from apocalypse to Hekalot literature? He says there's a continuity, that they're similar and they share similar assumptions, and that later Jewish mystical texts have a different set of assumptions. There's a change at the end of the Hekalot literature, about 600 AD, 700 AD, or something like that. He doesn't go beyond that because his goal is to figure out why we end up with texts like the Merkava and Hekalot. Now, so there's two terms here, Hekalot and Merkava. What's that? Now, notice there's different ways to pronounce Hebrew. Schaeffer uses the modern Hebrew pronunciation, so do most medieval and modern Jewish pronunciations. This V is often a B in ancient, so it's Merkava would be the ancient way. So you'll see it spelled both ways, and there's other differential things. But a Merkava means a chariot. It literally means, Rakab means to ride. A Merkava is something you ride on, a vehicle of some sort, and it means chariot. In biblical Hebrew, it's generally translated chariot, although it could be a wagon or something. And in modern Hebrew, it is a tank. The Merkava is what they use for tank. In fact, they call their tank the Merkava. It's a model of tank or whatever. Anyway, Merkava is the chariot throne of God that is found in the vision of Ezekiel that we'll be discussing next time. Merkava and Hekalot are interrelated mystical texts from about 100 to 600 AD. Another thing he claims, there's a peculiar relationship between the heavenly ritual of the angels, that is, the angels in heaven that surround the throne of God don't just sit there, they do rituals. They sing hymns, they say prayers, they make petitions, they do all sorts of different things. Okay? And there is a connection between the rituals that the angels do and the rituals that the priests do. So angels do a certain thing before God, and the priests on earth do the same thing. The priests are imitating the angels. What the angels do, the priests imitate. And that when the temple's destroyed, the mystic can worship at the heavenly temple and participate with the angels in the angelic ritual, even though the temple is destroyed or defiled. Now, right now, that just seems like a weird idea, but as we go through the text, you'll see how this is reflected in the text we're talking about. Okay? Has everybody got those two ideas? The next thing to note is his view on Unio Mystica. What is Unio Mystica?
Union with God.
Yep. Union, one mystical union. Okay? Now, from Merkava Hekalot texts back, you don't find mystical union. What you find is transformation. Okay? And this is pre-Neoplatonic. This is a key thing he's arguing, that basically, he argues it I made a quote from him down here. Oh, it's in his next chapter. So we'll cover that later. But basically he's saying, oh, here it is. Sorry. Modern definitions of mysticism are informed by Neoplatonic ontology. And he says this on page 19, which I will quote. Wolfson, who is a major scholar of Jewish mysticism, with whom I had dinner once. He's an amazing guy. One of those guys who's, eidetic, what is it called? Photographic memory. Eidetic memory, he knows everything. Wolfson finally gets, I hate him for knowing everything. I don't hate him, I'm jealous of him. Anyway, Wolfson finally gets to the root of the problem by stating that modern scholarly tendency to focus on mystical union as the very essence of mysticism is informed by Neoplatonic ontology. That is, that's what Plotinus says, and everybody picks up on that and follows with it. So there's a major shift in what's going on with these types of texts from pre-Plotinus to post-Plotinus. And basically he's saying earliest Jewish mysticism is not Platonic, except maybe Philo. Namely, the assumption that the contemplation of God results in a form of union whereby the soul separates from the body and returns to its ontological source in the One, meaning God. Insofar as the One is beyond intellect and being, the return to the One is depicted in figurative terms as a mystical merging of the soul with the Godhead. Okay? What Schaeffer argues, and Wolfson for that matter, is that the older form is the transformation of the adept, that is the mystic, resulting in his angelification, that is he's transformed into an angel, or deification, that is he's transformed into a god. Now, the boundary between those two things is sometimes vague. Okay? So notice, what we're talking about is an ascent into heaven, but not just to see a vision, but to be transformed into an angelic or godlike being. That's the purpose of ancient Jewish mysticism. After about 600, it changes. Well, even a little later now, maybe 800. There's a radical change. And it's all linked in with Neoplatonism. And we'll see the same thing in Christianity with Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite, whom we will discuss later. Now, the big example he talks about in the first chapters is Enoch's transformation into Metatron. Who's Metatron?
It sounds like
yeah, it's one of the Transformers, right? Megatron, and anyway, no, he's not. He is Enoch, who has been transformed into angelic being and serves as the servant of the face of God. That is, he's the prime minister of God in heaven. Okay? And he gets to be enthroned beside God in some of the stories. This is called synthronos, which means enthronement beside. And if you look at the New Testament, you'll see Christ is enthroned beside God. And in Jewish tradition, it's Enoch. So what these Enoch traditions are talking about, at least in its later form in 3rd Enoch, is taking Enoch to be Christ. That is, Enoch does for the Jewish mystics in 3rd Enoch what Christ does in the New Testament. You also see the enthronement of the apostles who sit beside God in Matthew here, and you see the disciples enthroned, sitting by Jesus, and you see the 24 elders enthroned around Jesus. Okay? Or enthroned around God. So this is, scholars debate whether it's angelification or deification. But it is the radical transformation of the mystic or the prophet into a divine-like being who then dwells in the presence of God. Now that's ancient or pre-800 AD mysticism for the Jews. Okay? After that, it's radically transformed. And what you're reading in Untermann's book is more of the transformed type of mysticism, which we'll get to in a second. Okay, mysticism cannot be removed from culture, language, place, or time. That is to say, he's a historian and believes you've got to clearly tack these things down in a particular place and time. It has no real meaning in the history of Jewish religion. What he says is if you try to make a universal mysticism, it is ahistorical, that is, doesn't fit any particular time or place. It is ideal, that is, it's not a real, what really happened, it's an ideal that you're making, and it's essentialist, that there's an essence to mysticism, which are all assumptions which he rejects. Schaeffer rejects these things. Now, Untermann probably accepts them. Personally, I agree with Schaeffer, but that's another matter. Lots of people think that there is an ideal essentialist essence to mysticism. I kind of don't believe that, but that's another question. Okay, notice he is literary and philological, very much into text. His book is divided into, okay, here's what this text says, next section, here's what that text says, then another text. So he's very much focused on texts and historical change through time. Now, two problems to think about. Number one is the question of phenomenology. See that word there? The problem with studying religion is that most of what goes on, most of what's really important in religion is the inner spiritual life of the person, which cannot be studied directly. It can only be studied indirectly through texts or maybe oral descriptions. What historians of religion have come to do in an attempt really to imitate the physical sciences and empirical sciences, which I don't think you can do with history, and especially you can't do with religion, but that's what they want to do, is they want to make the study of religion more empirical. And so they study phenomenology, which means what you can directly observe in a religion. You cannot directly observe the inner spiritual life to know if a guy really has encountered God or not, but you can observe what he says about it, and you can observe, the rituals, and, you bow down to pray, or stand up and raise your arms to pray. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can directly observe. Notice phenomenology of religion is, in a very real sense, limited to whatever is contemporary so that you can directly observe it. It is extended methodologically to texts. That is, you try to reconstruct the phenomenology described in an ancient text. So you can kind of, transfer it backwards. Okay? So phenomenology is a particular approach to the study of religion. The other question is, and this is a problem with Schaeffer's approach, highly textual. The text is not the experience. The text is a record of somebody writing about an experience. So he is all concerned about what is in the text. That doesn't really tell us what's going on, right? I mean, and in a sense, you can't ever know what's really going on. Nobody can live somebody else's mystical experience, right? But it's a problem, because he essentially assumes what's important is the text, because he's so focused on literature, philology, and history. And that's all reconstructed from a text. But is he missing the essence? That's what the essentialists say. You got all this changes through time and space and text, but they're describing the same experience in different language, Arabic versus Hebrew, or different terms, terminology, and things like that. Okay? And we've talked about his summary of the book. Basically, he goes through a series of texts and tries to interpret them and understand them and see their interrelationships and development through time. And he covers the main Jewish, what you call mystical type texts, from Ezekiel on down to the Hekalot Merkabah, 6th, 7th century AD. Then he stops. Okay? Everybody clear on that? Questions?
I think I did not get that from the text.
It's okay. That's why I'm summarizing it.
Yeah.
I think it should, with that background in mind, I think you'll
Get it a lot better.
Yeah.
It was just like jumping into the middle of a very long conversation.
Right.
Very
He is
long.
arguing with a bunch of other scholars for the past 100 years. Some of them alive, some of them dead, right?
Yeah.
Right. It will. It's still a difficult book, but it will be more clear when you read the next chapter 1. I don't know if you've started that or not, but it should be more straightforward because he's just going through a text and interpreting it, and he goes through another text and interprets it. Then he sees how they're related and different. Yeah. Okay. You've read part of it. Okay. I think it should get better, but I just wanted to explain all the issues related to not all, but a bunch of the issues related to that. Now, the Untermann book begins with a historical summary, very brief, of Jewish mysticism from basically the Bible on through contemporary times. So he is covering the whole experience of Jewish mysticism, which in one way is good because you get lots of different things in there, but in another way is bad because there's a lot of differences that change through time. So basically, Schaeffer covers up to here, okay? But Untermann goes from early medieval on till the present, and it goes down a little bit below the screen here, and focuses on basically from here, okay? So there's kind of a gap in the middle, but in the middle too, there's fewer texts, so it's harder to follow what's going on. So basically, in the biblical times, we're talking about celestial ascent and apocalyptic as the forms of mystical texts, added to which are Hekalot and Merkabah texts. Okay, these will be discussed by Schaeffer, so we'll worry about them later. But he does mention 2 specific texts, Sefer HaYetzirah, which is maybe 7th, 8th century AD, and Sefer HaBahir, maybe 11th century AD. These are 2 foundational texts for what follows. In fact, they're probably more important for what follows than what precedes it. And a lot of these texts are actually lost. That is, when when Schaeffer goes through down to the Hekalot, many of those texts are in the Dead Sea Scrolls or in the Apocrypha, which the rabbis never preserved. And so what gets picked up by the rabbis is really just rabbinical texts, some of these, and then these 2, and that launches what you'd call medieval Jewish mysticism, which in many ways is quite distinct. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, let's briefly go through. We're going to look at these later. This is Sefer Yetzirah claims to be a text by Abraham describing the creation of the world, and it is all about words and numbers intertwining together. Because how does God create the world? He says things, and so words are creative, and numbers are creative. First day, second day, all these types of things. So they mystically interpret all this stuff into a really strange, almost geometrical, mathematical, but also mystical text. Sefer HaBahir is more like it's more of a foundational mystical text, more straightforward mystical, okay? And we're not going to worry about these guys too much because they're beyond they're just their own thing. But these movements, this was in the Rhineland and this was in southern France and Spain, they culminate in the creation of what's called the Zohar, which is a massive compilation. It's a huge commentary, an esoteric interpretation of the Torah. It's really strange stuff in there. They go through all sorts of stories and visions, and Elijah comes down and talks to them and tells them something. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So this is then the foundational text for all subsequent mysticism. The Zohar is this major break. These things are still around, but all interpreted through the Zohar. Now, the Zohar remains a hidden mystical text only used by a few rabbis until Isaac Luria and the Safat group. Safat is a city in Galilee. Safat, it's Safed, I think, in English, but and it's kind of northwest of the Sea of Galilee, up in the mountains, northwest of that. Isaac Luria was a mystic who interpreted the Zohar in his own unique way, And his interpretation of the Zohar then remains foundational for all subsequent Kabbalism. Does that make sense? And everything in here is Lurianic. That is to say, it's based on Luria's interpretation of the Zohar, which is an interpretation of earlier Jewish mysticism, which is an interpretation of the Bible. That's the nature of Jewish literature, is it's always a commentary on a commentary on a commentary on a commentary, right? Those never ends. Now, all of these things we'll go into more detail on a little bit later, okay? So, I'm just giving you the overview now. So I don't expect you to get it all straight at this point, all right? But just so you know, this is kind of the overview. Yeah?
For ultra Orthodox Jewish traditions that are alive today, are they often mystical in this way, often Kabbalistic, or is that
Yes.
more rare?
Yes. The Hasidim, we'll talk about them in just a second. Absolutely. There's strong mystical elements in all of that. Okay, the first thing to note then is the Zohar was a secret text for mystical rabbis. Lots of rabbis didn't like this stuff. It was underground. It was only for men. That's another characteristic of Jewish mysticism, which is different than Christian, because Christians, lots of women get involved, especially after the 13th century. But Judaism is always straight men until maybe 20th century. Okay, the other thing is Luria is alive during printing. And printing, when they print the Kabbalah, it creates a huge scandal because, number one, the real mystics say, you can't print this stuff, this is secret. If you let it out, it's going to be a disaster. And then number two, it spreads mysticism further. Instead of being a secret doctrine of the elites, it becomes a more widespread doctrine. And what we see, basically, Luria was not a publicist of this. He had a small group of a few dozen disciples in Safat, and he taught them orally his stuff, and he told them not to write it down, and he didn't want it spread around. And it was very messianic, too. It's kind of like end of the world stuff. Well, his followers and disciples wrote down his teachings and then eventually printed them against his explicit instructions, okay? So, he's kind of the last of the secretists, and then beyond that it gets more and more public. You also, at the same time, when these books start getting printed, the Christians pick up on this. We talked about Pico della Mirandola and Ruchlin and these other guys who, as part of the search for lost knowledge, learn Hebrew, read the Old Testament in Hebrew, and then find all this rabbinic stuff, and then start going wild over the mysticism. And it gets incorporated into Christian traditions up through maybe the 18th century, and then via New Age and Neo-Pagan movements, it comes into New Age stuff. So lots of Kabbalah stuff in New Age. And this really occurs via the Golden Dawn movement, which we'll discuss later. That is, in the late 1890s, there was this Golden Dawn movement of magicians that de-Judaized Kabbalah in a different way, in a pagan way. Then there's also Shabbatai Tzvi, who is a messianic version of a mystic. He's a Lurianic, that is, he follows Luria's teachings. He is a publicist. He's announcing this to the world. He is claiming to be the Messiah, and he's very mystical in his interpretations. Now, he is the most successful Jewish Messiah in history, in the sense of getting more followers. He had more followers during his lifetime than Jesus did by far. He is also one of the least successful in long-term impact because nobody believes him anymore. So he's a false Messiah to all the Jews. However, during his lifetime and in a generation or two after his lifetime, he was viewed as the Messiah, as is, for example, Menachem Schneerson of the Lubavitcher Chassid. You go to Safat today, you can see big billboards which says Hamelech HaMashiach, the King Messiah, and there's a big picture of Menachem Schneerson on it. Okay, so this is still, messianic mysticism is still really important within certain circles. Then you got the Hasidim, which means the kind of the pure ones or something like that. And this is, it starts out secret, then it becomes elitist, and with Baal Shem Tov, it becomes populist mysticism. So the average ordinary Jew who is a cobbler or something, he would just, do his Jewish thing, say his prayers, go to the synagogue, and that would be kind of it. Well, Baal Shem Tov, which means the master of the good name, that is, he knows the secret name of God and can perform miracles and stuff. And he's called Besht, which is BST, right? I mean, what they do is take the three initials of the guy's name and turn it into an acronym. You see this all the time, like Rambam and Baal Shem Tov is Besht. Nachmanides is Nachman bin Maimon, Nachem or something. I can't remember what his nickname is. Anyway, he turns it into a populist movement where ordinary people have a mystical aspect to their religion. So the strict rabbis were very legalistic. The purpose of a Jew is to live all these commandments. Baal Shem Tov says, no, the purpose is to find joy in your encounters with God in ordinary life. And so he is popularizing mysticism. Now, and this movement, the Hasidic movement, is foundational to all subsequent. So, I mean, you get Lurianic, and then you get Hasidic, which is a version of Lurianism, and then you get the new movements. You see what I'm saying? There's kind of stages in this development. Now, in the late 19th, early 20th century, you find the scholarly rediscovery of mysticism. Basically, what you have in Judaism is what's called the Hashkalah. What's that? It's the Jewish Enlightenment. Hashkalah is enlightenment. Okay, it occurs in the late 18th century. It is influenced by Enlightenment movements in Europe, and for example, you've got Spinoza, Jewish Enlightenment Hashkalah guy. The Hashkalah guys basically reformed Judaism into a less legalistic form, but you also get then Orthodox Judaism deriving, or kind of trying to continue the old legalistic Judaism. These guys are the mystics. These guys say mysticism is bogus nonsense, and they really hate it and think it's stupid, and they avoid it. But in the early 20th century, you get the scholarly rediscovery of Jewish mysticism. It becomes an object of scholarly attention, as opposed to either being something that you despise or something that's kind of secret just for the Jews. You see what I mean? So that's another major development. And we'll talk about modern movements next time, just for a few minutes. And then we press on to the Ezekiel material in Schaeffer, and then the first stuff about God and so forth in Untermann. Questions on any of that? Now, in a time or two, I'm going to start having you guys do presentations in class too, right? So I'll give you like a week or more to prepare. I'll just say, you pick this one and you talk about this one in a certain day. Okay, see you then, or see you Wednesday.
Thanks.
My topic is Saladin, the
Okay.
conquest of Jerusalem right before the Third Crusade. Looking at him as a